Hi, I'm Peter Ryan. Welcome to the CX Files. Fifth Talent is a contact center and customer experience consultancy based in the USA. In mid-2020, this firm produced a landmark report based on survey results from over 4,000 contact center agents and supervisors that assessed the impact of the rapid shift to home working on the CX labor force. Now, since then, Fifth Talent has followed up with some new groundbreaking research conducted in late 2020, which sounded the views of contact center leaders, those responsible for the overall strategy of their organizations, to get their take on where the sector sits as we move into the new year. The feedback was provocative and something that any CX professional needs to consider as they plan for the post-vaccine period. The CX Files spoke to Fifth Talent's partners, Brian Kearney and Ted Nardin, to find out more. Well, Brian Kearney and Ted Nardin, welcome back to the CX Files. It's great to have you both chatting with us a little bit today about your most recent research.
Hey, thanks for having us back.
Yeah, I feel almost like Johnny Carson here, but at the same time, I think it's important for our listeners to realize that we're all old friends and that we have been in the industry together, developed great relationships by bumping into one another at different events. And certainly, I think one of the most important factors is hearing each other speak about their views and what they see as important going on in the CX sector. And this is really why we're assembled today to chat a little bit about some of the most recent research that Fifth Talent's done. And I'll start off with my first question, talking a little bit about that research. Now, over the course of the summer, Fifth Talent concluded what I think was some very provocative research and certainly some interesting findings about the shift to work at home customer experience delivery. Now, you've gone out into the field again, you've done some more research. Can you talk about the latest study in terms of who you spoke to and what some of the methodologies were and what you think were some of the key outcomes you were looking to try and find out about?
Yeah, Peter, I'll take that. So I think to give it some context about why did we do the second study is I'll just give a little context on what we did for the first study. And when everybody, back in March when there was that massive shift to put everybody at home, not only did we know that, hey, there are some challenges with at home, but I think we were entering a new era where ultimately there's no experts. I mean, we don't know what's going on when you do this in a rapid fashion. And so what we did was in that first study that you mentioned, we surveyed there's over 4,000 supervisors and agents across 7 different countries. And it's interesting, the main 3 things that we found out there was, one of the interesting things was, where do people want to work post-pandemic? And what was interesting is people, the number 1 choice was to choose a mixed model, where they wanted to work sometime in the center and most of the time at home was kind of how it turned out. So that was interesting. What was also interesting was almost no one wanted to return back to the center. Number 2 is performance actually got better initially. And this was during the May timeframe when we did this research. So that was also interesting, is why would performance get better when people went home initially? And then third area was, there are some issues with going to a work at home model. And so we got, these issues brought up by these supervisors and agents, things like effort, the amount of effort that it takes to work with each other and work with customers is going up. Loneliness is a real issue. And also just the people missing and being separated from their coworkers from not only a social and kind of support standpoint, but also for collaboration on how to actually do their job. They get a lot of, their expertise from their coworkers on how to do the job. And as we said in this first study, is these things with the issues, after about 6 months, start to cause challenges in the model. And so that's why we did this second study is, we gave it enough time to say, now how are things going? And we also decided in the first study, we talked to the supervisors and the agents, Now we wanted to talk to the leaders and get their voice in this. So what I did was got a great response, and thank you everybody who participated. I interviewed 41 contact center leaders. These are the actual leaders, not outsourcers. And I had a pretty decent even split between small, medium, and large companies. And like small was about under 200, medium was between like 200 and 1,000, and then large was plus 1,000 agents. And what's interesting is this covered 11 countries, their footprints, when you look at this, and it included outsourcers. About a third of them had outsourcers. And if you looked at this is about 40,000 agents internationally that were represented by these 41 contact center leaders. So if you want, I can talk about now the second part, the second study that we did, the findings from those interviews. The number one thing was that work at home fatigue has set in with most employees, and it's impacting performance. So that was a pretty interesting and major finding, that even people, they like working at home, but they're having challenges. Mm-hmm. And, that it's impacting performance. Performance got better. Now it is coming down, and that's a concern, especially things like adherence and absenteeism, which were amazingly improved initially, have now been dramatically reversing. And there's a concern now about attrition. And we've even been talking to some companies recently. Attrition is now a problem for many companies. Another finding is, unfortunately, leaders are in a holding pattern. So they feel like they have a lack of resources, number one, because they put a lot of their resources to put everybody at home and a lot of technology spend. There's a lot of uncertainty about COVID and other things going on in the world and the economy. And then there's also they're experiencing, as they've told us, their own fatigue. And this has been taxing on them as leaders. And finally, their own company and their executives have been in a bit of a holding pattern. So hopefully now that we've entered 2021, we'll see more of a shift with leaders taking much more action and being allowed to, quite honestly. And then another interesting finding was where do the leaders think they're going to have people work in the future? Not only now, but in the post-pandemic era. Right now, due to the pandemic, most people are not allowing their agents to go back into the center. So what they do plan, though, for the future, and this is what we mentioned in our first report, was that they will start to go to a mixed model and allow agents to have both work at home and working in the center, because there's a lot of benefits to that. And the biggest surprise that we had, going through this was, as I was talking to the different leaders, and they would tell me their story, and I would say, yeah, this is what we're hearing. Pretty common thing that that people are saying. And they're like, oh, you're kidding. I had no idea. I thought I was the only one suffering through this and having these issues.
Interesting.
And unfortunately, others are, but that's what's important. I thought was good about this survey was to get the word out that you're not alone. There's a lot of great things about at home, but there's a lot of challenges that you need to overcome. And there's kind of some relief that people thought, oh, okay, it's not just me. This model is a challenge.
And I think, Brian, thank you very much for that overview of the survey and of the key trends that you pulled out. Ted, I want to switch it over to you, because something that Brian brought out from the report and something that really hit me when I read the research was that whole issue about the fatigue around work from home, and the fact that we are starting to see that there is essentially some type of a burnout that's happening for CX professionals. that are delivering customer experience management or even supervising that. What do you think, Ted, is the primary reason for work at home fatigue?
There's a lot of different ways we can look at it, but I think it's important at first that we break it down into a couple of different fatigues. And there's a difference between what's been called pandemic fatigue, COVID fatigue, that type of thing, and work fatigue. Those are different. So you have a pandemic fatigue, which comes from constant worry about contracting the virus. It comes from the lack of movement or isolation imposed by the abatement strategies that we've had. So there's a lot of things that have crept up around things like lack of socialization and loneliness and these types of things. And those will wear on you, certainly. But in there, working in between all of this pandemic fatigue is what we call work fatigue. And that's what we describe that as is it's the weariness that you feel during the day or the end of the workday, regardless of whether there's a pandemic or not. And work at home fatigue is kind of a mesh of both of these and more that's added on top. What's interesting is the work at home fatigue is driven mainly by the idea that you have a physical gap between each other. And so it brings a lot of different things into play. But what it does impact is it, as you'd mentioned, it impacts really everybody. It impacts our frontline service professionals, but it also impacts management, in fact, both of them. And we can certainly get into more detail about it. But I think the key here is that it impacts the full range of the groups involved.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that, just to add what Ted said, is that physical gap. What's interesting is you look at it, customers and agents already had a physical gap, and they knew how to deal with that. Agents, have been trained how to do this through voice and chat and email to have these relationships and conduct, good business. But the challenge really is that physical gap that has been put between agents and supervisors and, in a sense, the agents in the company itself, and the culture being a little bit separated for them. And it's really these leaders and the management, and especially these supervisors, even in our studies, the effort there was much more a greater effort in this model to the shift at working at home for the supervisors. And unfortunately, when the effort is more, you typically have, two situations. You work more and you do less. And it's hard to get these boundaries of work and home life. So that's one of the reasons why, supervisors and management are the ones who really need to learn how to, bridge this physical gap that's going on.
And let me add three specific pieces to that as well. If you're looking at it from the leader perspective, we've outlined in other presentations, certainly happy to provide to the audience here, 6 major reasons for fatigue, but I'll cover just briefly the three major ones for leaders. One is called role ambiguity, and that's really just saying that now that I've moved into this at-home role, I'm not really sure exactly what my job is exactly. I used to really know, as a supervisor, I used to know exactly. I had this walking the aisles and I had this routine. I had all of these different things I did. But more importantly, I got immediate feedback either in by seeing the faces that I work with every day or from being very close to others, peers and my bosses and such. And so I knew whether what I was doing was on track or off track. And so as Brian talked about, that physical gap appears. Now we have people who have delay in communication, and you begin to question yourself. I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing. And that wears on you. The second one is called role overload, which is I now don't have a physical start and stop to my day. I used to show up in the parking lot. I knew that was the start. And then there was a stop at the end. And yeah, maybe I do some email at night or that type of thing. But I know that's extra work or I'm doing it beyond. Now it's difficult to put a boundary on that. And so now we have people working, and as they stated in many discussions here, is they're just working endless hours. And then the third one I'll bring out that seems to be the biggest people talk about is technology exhaustion. Some call it Zoom fatigue and stuff, but it's more than just Zoom. It's the idea that we are now transitioned to living in a two-dimensional world, and every single thing we do, we have to accomplish through that two-dimensional world. And we don't have that break anymore where we walk out of the office or walk the aisles or go to a meeting, a standing team meeting, or, all these things where we got a three-dimensionality to our work. And so this exhaustion that between just these three, as a little bit each, starts to add up. And you put that on top, of course, you got the pandemic and all of these other things Brian talked about. You get people wearing down, just wearing down.
And I think that that's a really important point you make, Ted, just in terms of thinking about our own professional lives, the fact that we're now, as people working in the customer experience field, contactable on how many different screens. We think about our computer screen,
Absolutely.
we think about our smartphones and the different applications or platforms on our smartphone that we can be contactable on. And it certainly is something that I think on that third point can be very draining, whether you're at the top of a company or whether you're a supervisor who's got a team of people that you're responsible for. And
Right.
It's that front line I'm really interested in pursuing in the next question, because one of the things that I noted in the research was the fact that there are some obstacles that companies are having now onboarding new contact center agents or CX representatives. Can you talk a little bit about what you found in the scope of this latest research that would speak to those different bumps in the road in terms of being able to onboard new individuals to work in a CX environment?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about that. There are three main challenges for that as well here that people express to us. I think it's a pattern we're seeing. And the first one is that the content for the training was just not built for distance learning. And there's a complete difference between classroom learning and distance learning. So just introducing video conferencing doesn't bridge that gap. So that's a big challenge. And a lot of people are trying to convert that, and there's some difficulty, and it takes time. So that's a challenge. Second one I would bring out is that we count a lot on the nesting process, what we would call, I used to call it Academy Bay and mentoring, those types of things. But it's that period of time from where you learn it in a classroom or a static environment to learning it live. Something bridges you. And a lot of people don't have the technology to do that from a distance. And they're trying to overcome that. Some people are trying to do the training or what they call nesting in person. But even that is problematic because at some point they still have to go back to this at home, and people just suddenly feel disconnected from the support groups. So there are a lot of different ways that they're approaching that, but it is a big challenge. And it all leads to really kind of this third one. I think it's the biggest concern we heard is that a loss of culture, that they're really not sure now what the culture really is for the company. It used to be based on seeing people in person and everything they did in a facility, and now it's distributed, and they're feeling a loss of touch with the employee base. And so keeping your culture as a company is a major challenge and a concern for the people we talked with.
No, that all makes sense. And I think to the point Brian made earlier, which was very relevant, the fact that attrition is certainly looking like it could become a problem, or for some organizations already is a problem in this new COVID-19 virtual working model. Being able to bring people on and to be able to keep them is going to be imperative, and I think significantly more difficult, as you say, because you've not necessarily got the right learning tools in place or the nesting environment and that ability to impart culture. So I'm guessing then, Brian, maybe over to you, that this is something that you anticipate for a lot of organizations is definitely going to be one of the things that they're going to be watching out for in 2021.
Yeah, it is. And it's an interesting situation that we haven't seen before. So, everybody's guessing a little bit, as I've said, and that's why we do this research and continue to talk to people. But one of the major things that's changed is this work at home model. Before was, hey, people opted into this model, they wanted this model, and they kind of stuck with the company because really the model, and they couldn't go get another, at-home job. Well, now all of that's changed. People like working at home, and there's an abundance of jobs that they can now go get. So if they're unhappy or, maybe not happy enough that they'll switch for, 50 cents an hour more or something like that, it's a really interesting situation that we're coming into right now, of the ease, of the agent to be able to switch jobs.
Now, one of the other elements I thought was really interesting as I read through the research a couple of days ago was the fact that it was indicated that outsourcers are managing performance better than captive operators. Now, this is something as somebody who covers outsourcing and works with a lot of different outsourcers, I thought was fascinating. What exactly would be the secret sauce that the outsourcing community has in terms of performance management in this very, very strange period we're living through that perhaps the captives haven't mastered yet?
Yeah, well, the primary advantage they have, well, it's pretty much two major ones. It's their core business, number one. So they know this industry. They know how to do this. They have to perform to survive. I mean, that's their business model. And number two is most BPOs have at least some type of experience already with work-at-home models. So because they're kind of experts in the industry and they have probably some familiarity. And what's interesting is even if some of the BPOs didn't really have at home before, they have probably executives who have, come from other companies who have that experience. So, and, they need to be responsive. So they were responsive. They acted quickly. And what's also interesting is a stated best practice by these contact center leaders was, hey, I leveraged my outsourcers for experience on how I could do this better and how we could do this better together. But what's interesting is, because this is only from the view of the contact center leaders, I didn't, for this study, interview the outsourcers and their leaders, because I wanted the view from the contact center leaders. The leaders are still concerned, though, and in working with their outsourcers about work-at-home fatigue for those outsourcers, plus, performance, same thing, went up and then is coming down. And there is that concern over attrition, which is typically a major concern with outsourcers since they typically have higher attrition rates than internal centers.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point there, Brian, in the sense that one of the things I've observed over the years as an analyst covering the CX space is that, yes, very much so, outsourcers, even if it was a small or niche amount, they've always had a presence in work from home. There's always been an understanding that work from home is an important factor. It's an important function they have to be able to offer if they're going to be relevant to the captive buying community. But you don't really hear, or up until recently, you didn't really hear about a lot of captives having work from home. There were some obvious examples that would be trotted out every now and again in the media, but for the most part, it was, from a captive operation standpoint, a way of working that we just didn't see a lot of up until recently.
Yeah, I agree.
So, final question for you, gentlemen, and thank you very much. These have been some absolutely fantastic insights you've provided. Let's look forward a little bit. Let's look towards the rest of 2021. And it's pretty obvious that vaccines are here. They're being rolled out across most different countries in the world. But it's also very clear, I think, that we've seen that these rollouts will take some time. I don't think anybody's expecting that a magic wand is going to be waved and everyone is going to be vaccinated in the next quarter or so. So, assuming that we've still got these elements about distancing, social distancing that are going to be in place for perhaps the first half of the year at least, what do you recommend that contact center operators do if they're going to keep their virtual workforce enthusiastic, engaged, and ready to deliver CX to the highest possible standard?
Well, let me jump in here and then let Brian jump in. But I just want to echo what you said about the vaccine and generally just COVID-19 and its impact, that I'm not sure we even need to consider it, because things have changed so much now that remove the threat of the virus and whether that be by vaccine or whatever, as you say, magic wand, there's still a very real issue around the new way people want to work. And not only the new way they want to work, but really what they're doing now. And it's now a major change to, in a sense, go back to the other way we used to work. So I think we need to take a look at this even from the perspective of what's the best way to keep things going, regardless of whether there's any sort of natural disaster that occurs. So I'll just start there.
Yeah, and what's interesting to follow up with some of the research to back what Ted's saying is, as I mentioned earlier, it was actually only 4% in our first study that people wanted to go back 100% to the center.
Yeah.
So people like at home, and they want at home, and I think it was a collective average of 75% of their 76% of their time would be preferred to be spent at home, and about the rest spent in the office. But we're even seeing this trend of even people who want this 100% at home, they want to work there, but they don't want 100% virtual. So just bringing people back in occasionally has had it turned out to be one of the top best practices with the companies and these leaders that I talk to. Those that are thriving and that have something that's even better than pre-COVID is partially because they brought people back. That was one of the most common things. And it doesn't have to be, even 2 days a week type of thing. It could be a couple times a month. And that has made an impact. So I think that's one of the things that you're going to see more is, as much as people say, hey, this 100% virtual is just amazing, go that, sell your center, do all of those things. It is definitely the most difficult model to maintain, especially going forward. I think once again, whether we're during COVID or after COVID, there is going to be a shift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what Brian's saying is, and said earlier, is it can be even better than pre-COVID with all of these things taken into consideration. I think what we have to look at to answer the question fully that you're asking, we believe from our research, is that we have to look at this sense of what is meaningful about work, and can you have a meaningful job working from home? The answer is yes. We know we can. But what's happening is we're finding that maybe that's not exactly translating from the meaningfulness that people found working in a center to the meaningfulness they're finding working at home. And some of this is possibly where there's a divide in people's enjoyment of working at home. So for example, there are a couple of different types of meaningfulness you can get from work. And one of them is meaning at work. And that is that the work itself gives you another social network. A lot of people refer to it as my home away from home, my family, my second family. And we really cater to that in the offices. And you think about all of the wonderful pizza parties we have, the meetings, the involvement, the activities and things we do. I was thinking about, we heard people trying to replicate Pajama Friday or, T-shirt Friday and all these types of things that we're used to doing. Because that's the meaningfulness we found was there amongst our peers and our friends. But it wasn't a meaningfulness necessarily driven by the actual work we do, which is another type of meaningfulness. And we call that literally meaningful work. And so I think if you look at what went away in moving from a traditional brick and mortar to suddenly, as you've called it, a Dunkirk sort of operation, where we now are suddenly in a whole different model, what changed? We no longer have that meaning at work. That is not readily available to us. And as leaders, as managers, as people in companies responsible for keeping the as you would say, the pace of things going and the morale, we really leaned on that. And so now we have to ask ourselves, well, if that meaningfulness isn't there, what meaningfulness is there? And we have always said, and what we're all about at Fifth Talent, is that this job can be extremely meaningful, and it's why people take it. But they take it because they want to help others. And so I think the more we can do as companies to ground ourselves in a culture that supports people having meaningful work, as opposed to the meaning at work, I think the better you're going to be at having a successful operation. And what happens is you have a huge transition. One is you have to assess where your culture is now. You have to understand what is it that's going on amongst all of the work at home employees. What's their experience? And then another part of that is, what have we introduced as what we would call grind? What's operating on these folks that's making it more difficult to work at home? And then the last part of that would be, you have to have a change of mindset as a leader. You're no longer a manager or a supervisor now, as much as you need to see yourself more of a life coach, being more involved in a broader, holistic relationship with the employees at large. So I think if we can bridge that gap and get there, we can actually have a better workforce and a brighter future than I think we even did previous to COVID.
Great stuff. Well, look, Ted Nardin, Brian Kearney from Fifth Talent, thank you, gentlemen, both very, very much. And before we go, can one of you just outline where any interested listeners can find the latest research you've done?
Yeah, well, one of the easiest places is our website, which is Fifth Talent, 5thtalent.com. And you can look at the resource pages. And also, you can also reach out to Ted and I personally, especially if you want to participate in any of the studies via LinkedIn or through our website.
Great stuff. Well, thank you both very, very much. We look forward to the ongoing research that Fifth Talent is undertaking. And thanks very much to you both for the positive energy you bring the CX space.
Thank you, Peter. We love it.
Thanks for downloading the CX Files podcast. If you have a moment, please give us a star rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, because this really helps other people to find the podcast. If you have any suggestions for future guests, or ideas, people, or topics, then please just find myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan on LinkedIn and send a suggestion.